Thank you so much for having me. My name is Dr. Eric Crampton. I'm the head of research with the New Zealand Initiative in Wellington. I started here about a year and a couple of months ago, coming up from the University of Canterbury, where I had lectured in economics for about 12 years prior to that. One of the exciting things about moving to Wellington in a more policy-oriented role is that you get to do work that hopefully is more likely to lead to policy change. And poverty is one of the things that we are tackling. We've got a couple of our researchers currently working on a project looking at the state of New Zealand poverty. Later on, they'll be doing another report looking at policy conclusions. So anything that I'm putting up today is kind of tentative and subject to the caveat that it might change once we have analyzed things a little bit further in our third report. But I am informed by some of the background work we've done there and some of the background work we've done in other areas. So we'll get going a little bit on that. So first off, what I'd like to note is that over the long term, the only real cure for poverty is economic growth. For millennia, the state of almost every human being in the world was poverty that we would consider dire and abject by any standard. This graph here is derived from work done by J. Bradford DeLong at Berkeley, who was measuring economic growth from 1 million BC through present. So they go a really long way back. And per capita income for just a huge proportion of history was under the $1 a day threshold that we consider to be a benchmark for international hardcore poverty. Economic growth picked up in the 1700s and has been going ever since then. And that's what has started dragging us out of poverty. Now, poverty, internationally speaking, is relatively rare. It's been declining substantially internationally, and that's been dispersing through China and India and ever-increasing parts of the developing world. We've been having a great story of triumph. Now, how things looked in New Zealand. This is all derived from some work that we had done last year in a booklet that we called The Case for Economic Growth. So here I'm starting in 1953 and looking at how economic growth has been shared across different types of earners. And this is derived out of work by Thomas Piketty, looking at his database, the World Top Incomes database. We normalize everything in 1953 to being equal to 100 because that's when the consistent data series starts. Before that, the data isn't quite as comparable. So compared to 1953, somebody who is in the top 10% or the top 1% is earning $1.50 now for every dollar they were earning in 1953 in real terms. That's real growth. That's really important. But you'll note, too, that among those in the bottom 90%, they're earning $2 for every dollar that they were earning in 1953. You can see some of the 80s reforms had some slowdowns, and we'll highlight that a little bit in just a minute. But economic growth has been fairly broadly shared. A lot of people are now doing much better than they were before. So for all of the talk of all of the gains are just in the top 1% or the top 10%, that's not characteristic of the longer history here. If we look at the more recent history, it is true that a greater share of the growth has gone to those in higher deciles than lower deciles. But if we start in 1982, just prior to the economic reforms, again, normalizing incomes to 100, you'll find that for every dollar that somebody in decile 2 was making in 1982, this is household data, and this comes out of Perry's work for the Ministry of Social Development. He's got the most comprehensive data in the country on this stuff. For every dollar somebody was making in the bottom 2 deciles in 1982, they're making $1.20 now in real terms. In the decile 8, it's $1.30. Income growth has been shared. People are doing better. And again, this might be a little bit different from some of the narratives that are pretty prominent. I want to kind of make sure we're starting from the same sort of data position. And one reason for that is that there are some real trade-offs when we start thinking about income policy and economic growth and redistribution and measures that can help alleviate poverty. One of these is that there can be a trade-off between doing things that help those who are currently poor and policies that help ensure that people gain more wealth over the longer term. Economists characterize this with a leaky bucket experiment pretty typically. So imagine that you've got a set of rich households over here and a set of poor households over there, and you can scoop $1 worth of wealth out of this cohort here and carry it over to the poor cohort over there, but your bucket is leaky and you're losing money out of the bucket as you go, and it's just pure waste. How much waste are you happy to tolerate to move some wealth from richer people to poorer people? There are real trade-offs. There are also real trade-offs between policies that help the poor in New Zealand and policies that help the poor internationally. And this is one that worries me a lot. When we think back to the debates over how many refugees New Zealand could possibly help during the Syrian crisis back in August, the government was floating numbers around about costing $80,000 for the government to help a refugee transition and support them through provision of education, health services, income support if it takes them a while to find a job. Every time that we do very nice things to help those at the bottom by increasing the amount of support that we provide, we are at the same time raising political hurdles that make it harder for us to accept lower income migrants and to help them. Because the narrative that, well, it's going to be expensive to help them, do we really want to let them in? That's pretty compelling to a lot of people. But under any possible kind of accounting, people overseas in dire circumstances are far worse off than those here. So we've got a trade-off between helping the currently poor and ensuring stronger economic growth to help economic performance and reducing poverty over the longer term. And we have a very real trade-off between helping people abroad and helping people here. That helps inform some of the policy solutions that I'm going to be talking about. I'm trying to find the ones that don't do harm to economic growth and hurt our long-run prospects, and also the ones that don't make it too darn hard for us to help people overseas. So that's where I'm coming from in this. Maybe you've got different values from mine about the weighting of those who are here compared to abroad. It worries me when we worry more about poorer people who are here than people who are in worse circumstances elsewhere just because we are less likely to see them. But that's just my value statement, and I thought I'd put that up. So, what to do? Because we were asked for 5 things to do. I focused within 3 policy areas with 5 policy recommendations. And the first one that comes to mind to me is housing affordability. This is one that we can address fairly easily because it is entirely a policy-caused problem. This is something solvable. It is a self-inflicted wound. It is something that we are doing to the poor in New Zealand for no damn good reason. So here, this is again out of Brian Perry's work, and it's showing the proportion of households across different income quartiles that have housing costs in excess of 30% of income. And as you can see, the lowest income quartile is having the worst costs there. We had a big spike up in the early 90s, but that's mostly through decline in lower tier incomes during the period of reforms, which afterwards reversed. Now it's been more driven by housing costs. And while it's true that rental costs have not gone up by nearly as much as house prices, it's still in kind of crisis scenario. We're seeing work by Philippa Howden Chapman coming out of the health schools looking at just how bad the consequences of household overcrowding are, what it does to kids' education and to their health outcomes. We're seeing crazy diseases due to overcrowding because policy has decided that it is better to protect the character and amenity value of rich folks' neighborhoods who are politically powerful and to block any zoning changes that would allow those communities to become denser, allowing more housing to be built, and preventing places like Auckland from expanding in the suburbs. I was out in the Candela Town Hall meeting just a few weeks ago, and the number of people 3 or 4 times your age strongly objecting to that any of you might ever be able to buy a house there was just staggering. We have set policy to screw poor people and to screw the young in housing, and it's fixable. How do we fix it? We make housing cheaper by removing barriers to density and barriers to expansion within cities to reduce land costs. Land prices are the fundamental part there, but also housing construction costs. We are paying too much for building materials because we put tariffs on some of them. And why would we be putting tariffs on building materials when we have a housing affordability crisis? That's just nuts. Similarly, we make it hard to get building materials licensed for use in New Zealand. Why isn't it just automatically the case that a piece of drywall or something like that that's good enough for use in Tokyo or Vancouver or Seattle, other places that have earthquake risk and also have a wet climate, so you might have to be facing leaky building issues, why can't we just use those automatically by default? Be little policy changes that could reduce construction costs and could reduce the price of land, allowing more affordable housing to be built. It's not going to happen now because it doesn't make sense to put cheap housing on very, very, very expensive land. So developers have strong incentive to be targeting the top end of the market. That would change when we free up land for development and allow more apartment buildings to go up. There's work that is done by folks at Motu looking at just how costly crazy little design impositions are. So mandates that we put a balcony on every apartment and that apartments have minimum sizes. These are adding tens of thousands of dollars at least to every apartment that goes in. It should be up to people themselves how much they really want a balcony or a larger apartment. And people should be able to make the choice to go for something smaller and more affordable. We also noted by allowing foreign investment. The Productivity Commission has itself found some problems where New Zealand's construction industry is a little bit smaller than it might be. It's really hard for a foreign developer, though, to buy a few hectares and put in a subdivision on its own because they'd be hit by the Overseas Investment Act. Just let larger outfits from overseas come in and put up affordable housing. We're doing all kinds of things to make things harder than they need to be, to allow affordable housing to be built. So that's my policy area number one. And a nice trick on it too, it doesn't just help with poverty. Fixing land use planning by allowing more development in town works on all kinds of margins. It can make businesses more productive by allowing businesses to be located where they should be. It frees up money even for higher income people so they could afford to give more to charity if they wanted to. Right now, a lot of the gains from productivity increases within Auckland are getting sucked up by housing costs. They all get turned into the price of land. Free that up, people will be able to decide what to do with their income. What to do number two, watching the yellow sand. Employment. If we look at where poverty is concentrated, it's in households primarily single parent dominated, where there is little work going on. Median hourly earnings in the last income survey were just under $23 an hour. We often use 60% of median income as being one relative poverty line, but the minimum wage is already 65% of the median. Just working full time means that you're not poor by that measure. But a lot of people aren't able to work full time. Conclusion that I draw from this, encouraging work is part of the solution. Now, how does that turn into policy? I've got two answers, and one of them is that we don't really know, but we need to find out. And there I'm pointing to work that the Ministry of Social Development is already undertaking, where they're running all kinds of little experiments trying to figure out what works best in supporting people's moves out of benefit and into work. We know that kids who grow up in households with work do better. We know that being in work reduces poverty, and this is going to be one of the better long-term approaches. But the experimental approach, where we use data through the integrated data infrastructure, I'm sure that nobody else here yet has talked about this, but the government in the back end at Stats New Zealand has linked up the administrative data on everybody, from your interactions with the Ministry of Social Development, what you did through the schooling system, interactions with police, everything. They can use, so you guys are nodding, you've heard this before, it's fantastic, but it's really hard to get into. I can talk about that another day. Running these experiments to find out what works, scaling the ones that do, abandoning the ones that don't, recognizes that we often don't know what works and gives us a way of finding out. Point three is through skills building, which also is data-driven. In some of the work that we're now undertaking on education, we've been finding that the Ministry of Education is providing very little support to schools in helping them to figure out which of their teachers are more effective, which ones are producing outcomes, given the kinds of students that are coming into the classroom that are much better or much worse than other comparable classrooms. It'd be really simple to do this in the integrated data infrastructure. The government isn't doing it yet. We could strongly improve performance at the bottom end simply by giving schools some feedback on how they're doing compared to comparable peers, and then using that to start improving practice. Three, enabling civil society. My hourglass is running out, so I'll make this quick. The government doesn't have all the answers. Civil society organizations and charities often know better at the ground what's going on because they've got the interactions with people that they're trying to help where somebody sitting in a government office doesn't. The people in the government offices have better data, but they don't have that on-the-ground experience. So NGOs, whether supported by charity or through performance-based contracts with the government, often provide more effective services. We found the social impact bonds can be one way of funding this and delivering it. Family Help Trust, for whom I spoke a few months ago in Christchurch, they seem pretty effective in reducing family violence and improving outcomes. These are all civil society measures. Now, what can the government do to strengthen civil society? Policy recommendation number 1 there, number 4 overall. Let the charities come to the stats department and say, this is the program we want to offer. Let us know if it's working. You have all the data on all of our clients. You know everything about them. Tell us whether what we do turns out to be effective or not compared to other people that we can't afford to help yet. And then we find out what works, and you find out what works. It'd be totally easy to do. You just need a few data analysts in the shop to do it. And number 5, which is perhaps one of the more controversial ones, enhanced tax deductibility for effective charities. Once a charity has proven its effectiveness in contributing to the aims that the government has already specified they want in reducing family violence and improving child outcomes, give a dollar-for-dollar tax credit for contributions to those charities, or to ones overseas that have made the list of effective charities that are compiled by the folks at Effective Altruism and Peter Singer's outfit. So they're looking at which charities are really effective at doing good, do the most good per dollar spent, give a dollar-for-dollar tax credit to those outfits, and to the domestic ones that do well. And a nice trick with that, too, is the government then has to start competing for your dollar, because otherwise you might start giving it to a charity instead that's more effective if the government can't prove that it's effective in achieving the aims that you want it to achieve. So those are my 5 policy recommendations. Some of these are showing up in some of the work that we're doing at the initiative. We're planning on continuing with it, but that's all I had to be talking with you about today. So thank you for your time.